We were in the middle of a discussion.
This is better.
Thank you very much. Excellent. Okay. So what do we say? Rabbi Yochanan had said there's a halacha in Nazir that if money was set aside and it wasn't specifically designated which amount is going to go for the chatas, which is going to go for the ola, which is going to go for the shlamim. So then the money, and then the person dies, or let's say it's a woman and she says she's going to be a nazira, but the husband nullified the neder, was made for the neder. So then the money is just used to buy korbanos for korbanola to be offered on the mizbeach. Goes the nedava. That's a halacha according to Rabbi Yochanan. It's a halacha Moshe Misinai. So we said, oh, but isn't there another case where the same thing occurs? There's somebody like a woman who's a yoledis, a mitzvah, sets aside money for a kan. They have to bring a pair of birds, and they haven't yet designated which is for achatas, which is for an ola. That if they want to use the money for just achatas behema, they're going to bring it for something else entirely. The whole thing will be used for achatas, not even achatas oaf. We need all the money for achatas behema, or for that matter for an olas behema. Then that would be okay. And then we said that if the person dies before they have a chance to bring the korban all together, and there was most tumen, so that case also we say yiplu l'nedava, they would be allowed to bring for korban all as long as they didn't specify what was for which amount was for the chatas. We would say if chatas shemesu be'oleh, the money would be thrown liyam hamelach, would have to be destroyed. So we answered Tana Nazir chayav b'kinin d'adamuleh. That we included when Rabbi Yochanan said there's halacha Moshe Misinai, it doesn't only mean by Nazir, it means by any case where there's money, where the monies would have to be used to buy achatas plus other korbanos, and then let's say the person dies, where we say that the leftover money we just assume is all usable and can be used for purposes of buying korbanos ola. We don't worry about the fact that some of it was meant to be designated as a korban chatas. But lafuke v'lafuke meha, this is the fourth line, but it comes to exclude the following case where we would be concerned that the money would be considered potentially designated for chatas, and you would not be able to use it. Tanya, let's say that it's a brayso that talks about mishahayim mechuyev chatas. A person was already maybe he ate some chaylev by mistake. That he's chayav or some dam. He's chayav to bring a korban chatas. But then he imposed another chiyuv upon himself to bring a voluntary burnt offering, to bring a korban ola, and he set aside some money, and all that he said was this cryptic statement. He didn't say whether the money was for the chatas or whether the money was for the ola. He said, this is for my obligation. Well, which obligation? It might be for the chatas, it might be for the ola. So then we say, well, our girsa, the Rambam seems to have had a different girsa. So since it might be an ola, he can't bring, the money may have been set aside for an ola, he can't bring a chatas with it. Ola's behema, he wants to bring the ola with it, lo yavi, he can't bring it because it could be that the money was set aside for the chatas. The Rambam takes out the word lo for some reason. He says, yeah, that you could do, but okay. Mace, if the person dies, which is what we're focused upon, and the money was that he never clarified whether the money was meant for a chatas or whether the money was meant for an ola. So even though it was never specified, it was never mifurashin, nonetheless, in this case, we say yochel liyam hamelach, the money has to be destroyed, it has to be thrown into the salt sea, Dead Sea, whatever, and the money will evaporate because of the fact that it was partially set aside for chatas. So all the meforshim, including Rashi, Tosfos, they all, or the mefarish that we call Rashi and Tosfos, they all explain this case is different because it wasn't that it was one set of korbanos which included a chatas plus. This was something where there were two separate obligations. there was money set aside. We don't know for which thing the money was set aside. So then the halacha l'Moshe Misinai doesn't apply to this particular situation. It only applies to a situation where there is a combo package of korbanos that have to be brought together, one of which will be a chatas. And we say, since it wasn't specified which amount was for the chatas, so then it's not considered specified, and you can use all the money for a nedava. But if it's not a combo package, so then we say that we worry that it's like meant for a chatas, and then you have to destroy it. Okay, so Amar Ravashi, Hadir Amis Mefurashin Lo. So Rashi says this concept where we say that if the money, let's say for the korbanos nazir, have been set aside, and if you specified beforehand, the person who was going to bring it specified that I want this amount is going to be set aside for the chatas, and this for the ola, and this for the shlamim. So then if he dies, we say that you have to just destroy it because there's a certain portion that was set aside for chatas. So lo tema the amar el chatasi ve'el leolasi. So he says that, or at least you don't have to throw the whole thing into the Yam Melech, but the value that corresponded to the chatas would have to be thrown into the Yam Melech. So lo tema the amar el chatasi ve'el leolasi ve'el l'shalmi. It doesn't have to be a case where the person actually said, "Oh, this amount is for the chatas and this for the oil and this for the shalom." Even if he did less than that, it would be considered to be mifurash. And says Rabashi, Amar, even if the person just mixes it all together and he says the word chatas instead of saying elu lekobanosai, these are for my various kobanos, which would be considered to be most stumin. He spells out chatas. He doesn't say, "Oh, $50 is for the chatas and $40 for the ola and $30 for the shlamim." But he says all of it is for the chatas, ola, and shlamim. Then that would be considered to be mifurashin, and the portion that would correspond to what would cost to buy the korban chatas would have to be thrown into the Yam Melech. The Ikad alternative version of Ravashi, Amar Ravashi, lo tema ad the Amar el lechatasi lo las l'shlami. Not only, don't say it's only the case where the person says explicitly, "Oh, this money set aside for my 3 korbanos, including my korban chatas." Like the previous case, that was the previous version of Ravashi. That's the chiddush, that even though he didn't say this much is for the chatas, he just said the whole thing, the whole package is for the chatas, ola, and shlamim. That's also mifurashin. But here he goes a step further, and this is how we paskin. Ela filu amar elu lechovasi. Even if he says this is for my obligation, and we know that his obligations, some have the gears to chobosai, but we have the chovasi. Some have that gears in the Rambam, but not in my Rambam. So but even if he says elu lechovasi, these are for my various obligations. So what are his obligations? You just have to look in the Torah, the Eddie, and you can figure out it's chatas ola shlamim. So then it's as if he has enunciated the word chatas, and in that case as well, the chatas portion would have to be thrown, and the money would have to be thrown into the Yam Melech should he die. This is also considered kimifurashin. What then would not be considered to be kimifurashin? Some of the Mepharshim explain. If he would say Eluhen Kabanola Kabanosai, says the Kabanosai without saying the Chobasi, so then he hasn't really specified the chatas. That would be the most stumin case. What if he said nothing? I'm a Rava.
In this case, you throw out the chatas portion. The other portion, do you do case in this?
Yes.
Or so you don't do a shlamim at all.
Right, that's right. You could use it for nedava. I'm a Rava. How the amis most stumin yiplu nedava? That Rava said that which we said that the most stumin you would cast you would use for nedava purposes, right?
We're talking about strictly.
Well, he says like this. The Mishnah said like this. The Mishnah said in that case, if you had like the most mifurashin, go back to the Mishnah Chav Daled and Aleph. He said the demei ola you should bring an ola, and the demei shlamim you should bring a shlamim, but you only eat it that shlamim the yom echad because like a korban nazir would only be eaten for 1 day, so therefore it's not like 2 days. So it's not limited. So the answer is like the Mishnah says. Amar Rava good to chas. Amar Rava hadi amis most stumin yipul nedava. Rava says that which we said that the most stumin go to nedava. If it was not a most mifurashin case, let's say that you had, $1,000 that was set aside to buy your Chatas Ola and Shlamim. I don't know how much they go for nowadays. Let's assume that you could buy them all for $1,000 and they were set aside, and it would have cost the Chatas would have cost $500. And now the Chatas, and now $500 rolls off the table. Okay, falls off the table. And now all that I have left is the total value for the let's say that the Chatas cost $500 and the Ola cost $200 and the Shlamim cost $200. There was a total of $900. So $500 falls off the table. I know that the $400 that are left will not be designated for Chatas. It wouldn't be enough for the Chatas, right? In this case. So Harehen can Mifurashin. So then what's left over is considered like it's Mifurashin, that for sure it could only be used for the Ola and the Shlamim. Now the person dies, so we know that it's considered as if, even though he never said a word never came out of his mouth, we only said Elu Kobanosai. It's like these have been specifically designated for Ola and Shlamim because the Chatas amount fell off the table. And we know the Chatas would have cost $500. $500 fell off the table, and he died. So therefore, whatever is left over is coming for Russian, and therefore he would bring with half of it. He would bring $400 left. He would bring half of it. He would bring an Ola, and with half of it, he would bring the Shlamim without the lechem and only to be eaten one day and one night. So Tanya Kavase de Rabba, we have a brisa that supports Rabba. Ela lechatasi ve'ashalin zirosai. If he says he specifically segregates a certain sum of money for his korban chatas, says this $500 is for my korban chatas, the other $400 are for my other korbanos that I would have to bring, the Ola and the Shlamim. So then it says explicitly, like Rabba, to make chatas yochel Yam HaMelech, the money for the chatas gets thrown into the Yam HaMelech, okay, because we know which amount that is, that was specified. And the other amount is also considered as specified, even though he didn't say the words Ola and Shlamim, it's considered as if it was specified as well. So you treat it like most Mifurashin, where the amount that corresponds to what he needs to buy the korban ola is used to buy a korban ola, v'chetzkel the Shlamim, and the other amount is used to buy a korban Shlamim. And if it was misappropriated for personal non-sanctified use, he used all the remaining money. So then he would be guilty of mi'ilah, okay, of misappropriating sacred things, because a korban ola is considered to be something that you would misappropriate even before it is offered, as opposed to a korban shlamim, which is kachim kalim. So kachim kalim is not in that category. So if you only misappropriated a little bit that could have corresponded to the korban shlamim portion, so there's no me'ilah, because you could say that corresponded to the korban shlamim. But shlamim, there's no me'ilah prior to the zrikas damim, after which there's me'ilah with the amorin. But beforehand, there's no me'ilah. The ein molim b'miksasa. Let's say the person said elu le'olasi. He said, I'm specifying a certain amount for my korban ola, and the rest is going to be used for my other korbanos. So what are the other korbanos? We know they're the chatas and the shlamim. The ashar l'shan is zirosai. So demei ola yaviu ola. Umolin bahen. So the amount that he said was going to be for the ola, so he brings that money he uses for korban ola, and it's subject to me'ilah right away. If he misappropriates the money, he's guilty of me'ilah, misappropriation of sanctified items. Behashar yiplul l'inadava. But the rest gets given over to the nadava. Why in this case? Because that's the halacha l'Moshe Sinai of Rabbi Yochanan, that whenever I have a korban chatas funds commingled together with other funds, and I haven't specified which is chatas and which is the other, I didn't say the words chatas and shlamim, so then I say that it's considered most stumin. So the remainder is considered most stumin, and therefore, that's a special din with respect to the chatas, and therefore all the money then, if the person died, would go for purposes of bringing a korban nidava, bringing korbanos ola. Umolim bekula and meimolim b'miksason. The Vilna Gaon takes out these words, and he just says umolim behen, that they would be subject to me'ilah. But the other meforshim say no, that if I did me'ilah with only a certain portion of the funds, maybe that certain portion of the funds related to the korban shlamim, and the korban shlamim is not subject to me'ilah. Therefore, you would not be guilty of meila unless you misappropriated all of it. On the other hand, you could say that since it's all going for nidava, so it's all treated like korban ola funds, and therefore even with a little bit, you would be subject to mila. So we would understand why the Vilna Gaon took it out. So Amar Afuna Amarab lo shanu elamos. So Afuna Amarab says that this whole halacha that we're talking about, in which we distinguish between most stumin and most mefarashim, that's if the nazir set aside money. But let's say he actually set aside animals. About behema hareyokim mefarashes, he sets aside the 3 animals, so then it's considered to be like he was actually designating which is for the chatas, which is for the ola, which is for the shlomim, because there's a heker. Because the one of the animals has to be a zachar, namely if it's a korban ola, it has to be a zachar. So I see as a male animal, so I say, oh, that must be the ola. The chatas is in a keva, so I say, oh, it's a female animal, that must be the chatas. One of the animals is more than 1 year old. And it's a korban shlomim, which has to be more than 1 year old. So I say, so I can tell very easily which is the chatas, which is the ola, and which is the shlomim. So therefore, behema reikim mefereshes. So Amar Rav Nachman hadu ami behema reikim mefereshes. Rav Nachman says that which we say behema is like mefereshes, that it's like it was specified as long as you set aside the animals, even though the person didn't say this is chatas, this is ola, this is shlomim. Therefore, it's treated like mefereshes. If he dies, so the one that was the chatas has to die. Lo shanu ela tamima. That's only if it was these animals were worthy of being bought as kabbanos themselves because they were unblemished. Ababalas mum, but if it was blemished, and this is how we paskin that we draw this distinction. So that's like money because you'd have to sell and redeem that animal anyway, and use the money in order to buy the kabbanos that you needed. So we say as long as you didn't say the words chatas ola shlomim, it doesn't matter. It happens to be a young nikeva. It's just the money that you're using anyway. Hareyu kistuma, therefore, it's considered to be stuma, and it's treated with the halachos of stuma that the person dies. Just sell the animals and bring all the and buy korbanos to be bought as korbanos ola as nedava. Aval niskolo. But if it's silver pieces, I have pieces of silver. So then I say pieces of silver are considered to be specified. Since there is 3 separate pieces of silver, it's not like a bunch of dollar bills segregated together, but I have 3 separate silver pieces. So then I say it's considered as if the person has said, I want one of these for chatas, one of these for an ola, and one of these for a shlomim, as if he spelled it out. Nachman bar Yitzchak says, what are you talking about? I feel niska, even niska is considered to be stumin. You didn't spell anything out. That's considered to be stumin because you can make money out of it. However, if it's something which is not as easily transferable to money, like I have beams, okay, I have various wooden beams and the like. About soar shokoros, I set aside 3 wooden beams, so I don't consider that to be quite on the same level as money. That's what he says. And therefore low. Therefore, Nachman bar Yitzchak says in that particular case, if I had a soar shokoros, then it would be considered as if it was mifurashin, that this beam corresponds to chatas, this beam corresponds to ola, and this beam corresponds to shlomim. Even though you're going to turn it into money, it's not something which intrinsically looks like it's transferable so easily into money. So Amalei Rav Shimi Barashi Rav Papa. So Shimi Barashi said to Rav Papa, "My tamayu the Rabbanan." What's the svara according to the Chachamim who say that everything is stumin? Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak said, "Well, at least the soar shalkoros is going to be considered to be mifurashin." The Chachamim are saying everything is stumin. If it's not money, I'm sorry. Say the Chachamim say like this. Chachamim say only money is considered to be stumin, and nothing else is considered to be stumin. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak says that the nischa is also considered to be stumin. But what about the shita of the Chachamim who don't agree that even nischa is going to be considered to be stumin? They say nischa is considered to be mifurashin. So what's their svara? The army most below behema. that only money is considered to be stumin. And if I had a behema, so then that's that. I say especially behema spouse mum. So it's not considered to. Or say I'm sorry. If they have a behema which is a regular behema, so for sure it's mifurashin below nischa. And similarly, nischa, if it's silver pieces, it's not considered to be stumin. It's considered to be mifurashin. Mos velo saba. Now, only Mos is considered to be stumin, but a soar shalkoros is considered to be mifurashin as well. They say everything is considered to be mifurashin unless it's actually money. Elameata, but if you're going to follow that svara, then you should also say that if a person designated birds for their kinin, so we would say Mos below ophos, that ophos are not considered to be mifurashin, even if they're set aside. We're going to that we should say ophos are mifurashin. Only Mos are considered stumin, and ophos would automatically be considered to be mifurashin, even if you set them aside without designation. This one is for the chatas, this one is for the yola. Ophos should always be considered to be mifurash. The only thing, according to the chachamim, that's not considered to be mifurish is Mos, right? The chitema hachinami, and you're going to say, it says of Shimi Barashi, that this is true, that ophos also, according to Shitas Chachamim, are always considered to be mifurashin. So then, and what do you do with Rav Chisda? Rav Chisda, ein akinim misparashos. Rav Chisda says that it's not true. The kinin are only considered to be mifurashin, only if at the time that they were purchased by the owner who needed to bring them, let's say it was a yoledis who bought them, or let's say it was a mitzor or a zav that bought the kinin because they needed to, bring a special korban where one bird would be a chatas and one would be an ola. So only if they specify at the time of purchase, which is the chatas and the ola, do we say that they're mifurashin, ibasiyas kohen, or at the time that the kohen takes them from their little, box, from their, a little bird's nest, and the kohen says, okay, this fellow is going to be a chatas and this one's going to be an ola. Why is it? Let's say that the owner in the middle decides to say, in between the time of purchase and the time the kohen offers them, decides to designate which is a chatas or an ola, or even if they're not designated altogether. But I know that there's enough. But I know that one of them will be eventually a chatas and one of them will be eventually an ola. So why don't I say in this case that they're automatically mifurashin according to the sheet of the chachamim? Why are they only mifurashin either at the time of purchase or at the time of offering? Amai hamos gemirin le. According to the chachamim, the halakha l'moshe misinai, that we treat an amount as stumin. So if the owner died, the one obligated to bring it died, so then they would be used for nedava purposes. That only applies to money. Hamos gemirin law. So why don't we say the same thing over here? That the birds should always be considered to be mifurashin. So Amalei, so Papa, yes. Huh? Oh, turn it. Okay. So Rav Papa responded. Rav Papa responded to Rav Shimi Barashi. He says, "Ulataimech." That according to you, in every single circumstance that it's not money, it should be considered to be. You're arguing that we see that in the case of the birds, it's considered to be stumin. It's considered to be stumin as well. So according to your reasoning, it should be the following situation should also be considered to be like stumin. Well, the Taimech Hadithan, Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel Omer, or Shimon Gamliel says, Hevi Shalosh Behemos. If a person has set aside 3 behemos below Pirish, and he didn't say which one is going to be bought for the Chatas or the Ola or the Shlomim, this is a case of Nazir, right? And he didn't say, so I look at them and I say, the one that's the female, the young female is the Chatas, the young male is the Ola, and the old one is the Shlomim. Haruya lechatas tikra chatas, leola tikra ola, leshlomim tikra shlomim. So what do you do with that Mishnah according to you? Obviously, we see that there is such a shita in the chachamim that this principle of stumin only applies to Mos and clearly doesn't apply to behema. In the case of behema, we are going to consider it to be mifurash. And amai ha'amris behema lavkim mifuresh is damya. Then you say that a behema is not considered to be mifereshes, because you're arguing from the case of opos. So amalei. So this is a little hard to read this amalei because it sounds like, and this is how I think the Meforshim generally explain it. Sounds like Oshimi Barashi is answering this question of a papa, but he's also answering his own original question as well. So that's like a little unusual. He asked the question, and there was a retort to ask a question back to him. He's answering that question. Now he's going to answer his own question too. So Amalei, so he answers.
Question is to support
Um,
in a way. I thought whenever.
Well, Rashimi Barashi was asking Akasha. He's saying, "My time out the Rabbanan. How do we explain if the Chachamim say the only stumin case is considered to be mos? So how do we explain it that opos are considered to be stumin? How do we explain it?" So he didn't answer the question, but now he's going to answer the question. So Amalei Hassam, he says, I have an answer to answer all of it. Okay, here's the answer. In the case of opos, it's true. Normally, we only say the most are stumin, but there are exceptions. So in the case, and everything else is considered to be Russian, but opos are different. Why? Hasam v'lakach v'asam arachman. It's a special gzeres hakosu when it comes to buying the birds, right? Let's say it's a yoledis who needs to bring birds. So it says im losim sa yada de sev lakacha shtei sorim. She buys two turtle doves or pigeons, right? And at that point in time, sets one aside for the Ola, one for the Shlamim. And then the pasuk goes on to say, the Asa HaKohen, Es HaEchad Chatas Ves HaEchad Ola, that in the context of Kenan, that it's either determined at the time of the Kha or determined at the time of the Asa, which one is going to be the Chatas to the Ola, but the rest of the time, it's automatically going to be Stumin. It's a special din by Ophos. V'lokak v'asa. It can only be at those points in time. Hachanami, here too, in the case of the Nazir who set aside the three animals, so we say that for sure, this is going to be Mifarashin. Mimatzis Amris Haden Dechatas Tikvavola Hachanekeva Hachazachar. So there too, it's 100% clear which one is being set aside for the chatas and which for the ola, even though the person didn't say anything, because we know that they look different. They're different genders. The korban ola has to be a male, and the korban chatas is in a keva. So therefore, in this case, so of course it's 100% clear which are mifarashin. So that kasha is not really a strong kasha. Because obviously, even if you would say otherwise, that a stumin would count, that it would count as stumin. So obviously, in this case, it's going to be mifarashin. In other words, these cases don't lend themselves to kashas one way or another, because they're both special cases. One case is clearly that the birds would be considered to be stumin based on gzeres hakasav, and the other case, clearly the behemoths would be considered to be mifarashin based on gzeres hakasav. But otherwise, as a general rule, we're going to say that the principle only applies to most. It doesn't apply to these other situations of niska or soar shilkoros. We would say that they would be viewed similarly as stumin, or I'm saying they would be viewed niska and soar shilkoros would be viewed as situations of mifurashin as opposed to stumin. Okay, so masiv of hamnuna, and that's how we paskin. That only most are considered to be stumin as a general rule, unless there's a special exception for the cases that we mentioned. But these other things would be considered mifurashin, and clearly the behema case goes without saying. So masiv of hamnuna, mi amina behema balas mum kestuma. But what about the balas mum? Balas mum we are going to view as a stuma situation. So why do we view that as stuma damya? So he says, I have a kasha on that. Tashma amu ketzad amu aish megaleach al nisirus aviv. How do we say, in what circumstance? We're truncating the Mishnah a little bit. Mishnah talks about a case where both a man and his father had vowed to be Nazirim, and it talks about a case where only the father had vowed to be a Nazir. The question is, when is it that the father dies when is it that the son would be allowed to use the korbanos of his father that have been set aside? So generally speaking, we say he can't. So bisman shahayahu be'aviv nazirim. So the Bach changes this case to the first case where he was not a Nazir, only his father was a Nazir. And his father set aside behish aviv mos naziru. So and the father set aside money for his naziru. So Mason, the father died. Nazir, and now the son says, I want to be a Nazir. This is the case where he wasn't a Nazir before. And he says, now I want to be a Nazir and I want to use the korbanos that was set aside by my father. Amos Abba. So what's the din in this particular case? The Bach tells you the din based on the Mishnah later on. He's not allowed to use the money that was set aside by his father for his korbanos. If he wants to become a Nazir now. In the case where he himself had vowed to be a Nazir, then he would be allowed to use the money. That's what the Mishnah says. That's why the Bach changes the girsa. Hayulamos stumos, if there was money that had not been specifically designated for which korbanos were going to be chatas olu shlamim respectively, yiplu linadava. So then that money is given over for Nidava to buy korbanos ola, not to be used for his own korbanos nazir, but it's yiplu linadava. That's the case of stumim. Haisalo behema mufreshes. If he had an animals that were set aside or mifureshes, we should say. So chatas tamus. So the animal that was set aside for the chatas obviously dies. That's the din. Ola tikvav ola, the ola you bring as a separate ola, shlamim yikavu shlamim. The shlamim you bring as a special shlamim according to the rules of a korban nazir, but without the bread, without the bread.
For the son.
Not for the son, not to be yotze any obligation. So my lab, when we say that the behemos are treated with respect to their respective statuses, chatas olu shlamim, that's referring even to the animals of balas mum, that we see that we're treating as mifurashin. And this is a contradiction to our statement that balas mum is treated as money and therefore would be treated as stumin. So my lab afilu balas mum. So we say, no, it's talking about a tamima. That's only if the animal is unblemished. If a balas mum is blemished, kistuma damia. So if so, we kind of know what the answer to this question is going to be if you learned enough Gemara. So my area most. So why then does it only say that what's treated as stumin is if the father left behind money? Say the same thing would be true if he left behind blemished animals that were set aside for the korbanos, that you should yiplu linadava, use the animals or the funds generated by those animals to bring korbanos ola. So we say, yeah, that's what it means. Hachinami, that's how I would view a balas mum, since I can't offer that animal as a korban. What's it good for? It's good for its monetary value. So it's the same thing as money. That's what most means. Hachinami balas mum l'may kedusha. What kind of a kedusha do you get if you sanctify an animal? It's a balas mum, not kedusha saguf, only kedusha damim. So therefore, it's only set aside for its money. L'demei dami hainu mos. So therefore, it's the same thing as money. So at least the case of the balas mum, I view as a case of mos stumin. So Masiv Rava. So Rava asked the question, and this is a very lengthy brisa. We'll run through it maybe. Korbano. So there are a number of psukim that have the term korbano in it. One of them relates to a nasi, and it says ve'vias korbano. The korbano yotze ve'eno yotze bekorbanovic. You see a person's yotze with his own korban and not with his father's korban. Yachol lo yotze bekorbano shalosh shipish minakala chamur minu chamur ala kala. Ve'yotze bekorban shipish shavi minakala kala chamur ala chamura. I might think that that's only if the father set aside an animal for a smaller favor, like shvuas eidus. The person said they have no testimony to offer and they lied. But yes, I can't use that korban for a chamura, like if the son ate chaleb, or the son ate dam, which is a much more severe favor. If he did it for mazid, then a person would be chayav misas bezdin, or the other way around. The father set aside a korban for a favor chamura, and the son can't use it for an avera kala that was for an avera kala. But if it was the same type of avera, I would think he could use the korban. Tamid lomar korbano. So that's why I have a separate use of the word korbano in connection with a regular chatas that a person would have to bring. And it says, what does he bring? Baby korbanot. So we see it doesn't matter even if it's the same type of infraction. So I might think it can't be Yosef with a korban animal set aside by his father for his death, with an animal that was set aside. You know, it's the same type of avera. Because if a person's father set aside animals to be a nazir and the father died, then the son can't use it for his own nazir. So Yosef, but you could use for money that the father had set aside for some sort of a korban katas. Because the father set aside unspecified funds for korban nazir, and both the son and the father had vowed to be a nazir, then the son is allowed to use that money. That's what the Mishnah says later on. So we say no. Even if it's with money that the father set aside for korban katas, it still can't be used by the son. Talmud Lomer, this is a separate pasuk in the same parasha as the previous pasuk, where it says, "Bim keves yavi korbano lechatas." Talmud Lomer korbano Yosef and Yosef korbano. Yaakov Yosef b'Moshe ifrish aviv. So I might think, okay, you can't use the money that was set aside from the father, even if it's the same type of avera that the money was set aside for, that the son wants to use it for, a chaylev dam, whatever. But I might think that the son could use the korban, an animal that he set aside for his own chatas, for one type of avera, for a different type of avera. So now I have yet another pasuk, which is in that same parsha, which says, "Oh hoda elav chataso asher chatav evi korbano sirasi sim tmiman keba al chataso." It has to be korbano al chataso. Ashe korbano l'shim cheto. It has to be brought only for that specific korban that he had brought it. He had set aside it for. So he had set aside this korban to bring a chatas on dam that he ate. He can't use it for a chatas on shvua seidus. Lo yachol lo yitzei b'behema, or even for the same type of avera. So yachol lo yitzei b'meh shevi shipish la'atzmo, and I might think, okay, fine. So we can't set aside. He can't use a korban that he set aside even for eating chaylev. He can't use for eating for a korban that he has to bring for eating dam, even though it's the same type of avera. Since I have this case today, it's a custom. Afilu min akal yadu what afilu min akal akalo min achamur al achamur. And so too, take out the word afilu here. Min akala al achamur or min achamur al akala. Shekain him hifrish behem al achelef behevi al adam or al adam behevi al achelef. Sheharei. What happens in this particular case? Hooray, lo mav, lo kiper. He's not able to take kedushas mizbeach, kedushas aguf, and he's not able to change around the kedushas aguf to take away its sanctity. So since he can't take away its sanctity, he also can't exchange its sanctity. He can't take away its sanctity. There'll be no meila. So therefore, there's no kapara because you can't take away the sanctity. Above what if he set aside money to bring a korban for himself? And he had not yet set aside an animal, just money that he set aside for, let's say, bringing a korban chatas for dam that he ate, and now he wants to use that money to buy a korban chatas for chaylev that he ate. Or even if he set it aside for shuas ha'idus, and now he wants to use it for having eaten chaylev or dam, which is a more severe affair. Shekenim hipish liatzma mos. Because if he set aside money which only has kedushas damim, maybe aladam, maybe alachelev, and he misappropriated it, shirimal. So then it's considered that he is able to misappropriate or to remove a sanctity of kedushas damim, so that it would be subject to meila. Once I say that it's subject to meila, so then he also should be able to effectuate a kapara with it, because it could be taken out of its sanctity. If it could be taken out of its original sanctity, then it could also have its sanctity exchanged for a different sanctity. So I would think that maybe he could be yotzei with that korban as well. Talmud Lomar says the market b'patish. I have one last pasuk in Vayikra Perek Dalet pasuk Lamed Hey, the end of the discussion of korban chatas. where it says al chataso one more time. It says v'chiper alav hakohen al chataso asher chata ad shekorbanu l'shem cheto. That it has to be a korban that's only brought because of that specific chet that he had set aside the money for originally. So why are we bringing this entire really, really very long-winded brisa? So it's to teach us the following. It's to teach us Talmud Lomar, the Ketani Mias, or it's to ask the following kasha. The kasha is Ketani Mias behema, that it says that if it's set aside for a behema, a person's not megaleach a behema sobiv. A person can't bring korbanos for behema of using the same behemos that the father set aside. Why is that? Because it's considered to be mefereshes. So my love afilu balas mum. So when we make that general statement, are we not even referring to a case where the father had set aside animals that were blemished animals, and we still treat them like mefereshes and not like most stumin? So we say lo tamima. It means unblemished animals. Balas mum, Mike is stumadamia. So you're going to tell me that a blemished animal is treated the same thing as a stuma, so the money couldn't be used for kapara, but at least it could be used to buy korbanos nidava. So my area, the Tani Moshe, so why then did we give as sort of like the contrasting case? Oh, where the father had set aside, money, so it might be a different story because the person is megaleach on money that was stumin that the father had set aside if he also had been a nazir. So why do we only write Moshe litni balas mum? We should say the same thing is true with respect to a balas mum. It's also treated as stumin. So we stayed the same answer we gave before. Hakinami, so too. Dilma dilamai chazia. What is the balas famous balas mum good for? It's good for kedushas damim. The demay hainu mos. But that's the same thing as actual money. So it's all included in most women. Okay, stop.